When it comes to any sort of gacha such as Fire Emblem Heroes, the idea is that eventually you'll go and attempt to grab the newest thing to beat the then current content. It wouldn't do much good if you could stick with the same thing all the time, as that would encourage less gacha, which, you know, not a great thing, ha ha ha, am I right? However, sometimes a unit will become too dominant or overstay their welcome, which is when IS has to step in and completely destroy any relevancy they might have had at the time. And in IS fashion, it's usually not subtle in the slightest. Here are many of the times where IS decided to blatantly counter or nerf a character in Fire Emblem Heroes. After a word from today's sponsor, today's video is brought to you by Tokyo Catch. Hey gamers, you like games, right? Tokyo Catch has games, but not just any game, it has crane games. It's effectively a Japanese arcade service at the palm of your hands, assuming you have hands, but if you don't, it'll be the next closest thing to that. The service allows you to control actual crane machines in real time and try for all sorts of prizes the site offers. This can range from figurines to plushies to trading cards or keychains and all sorts of other goodies that I probably forgot that are rotated in and out of the site at a consistent pace. No matter what, you'll probably find at least one thing on the site that catches your eye. And you might be wondering about the legitimacy of the crane machines, and I could say that after trying the service myself, I could say that they are very much legitimate. I didn't feel as if I was cheated when playing them or felt that I was wasting my time, although granted, I wasn't exactly the best at some of these because, yeah, I'm not exactly the best, but Tokyo Catch has an assist feature on many of the machines that will call an employee over and help you win if you haven't won by a certain point, which is what I used, although it definitely alleviated stress on some of the machines since it felt like I was going to walk away with something in the end no matter what. To be clear though, I did win some prizes without assistance because I'm not actually the worst, actually, if you can believe that, actually. The site also gives out all sorts of advice and contains practice machines to help you get comfortable with the services and machines they offer. I had to nudge one of the prizes to win one of them, which I wouldn't have really thought of if I just went into it blind, and after winning anything on the site, they'll ship them directly to you with free shipping available once every week. Overall, I was pretty impressed with the site itself and had a lot of fun testing out many of the machines, so if any of this interests you, then be sure to check out Tokyo Catch. Use the link in the description or pinned comment if you plan to check out Tokyo Catch, since you'll get 5 free tickets to use on the site. Thanks again to Tokyo Catch for sponsoring today's video, and with that out of the way, let's continue on with this video. As a preface, this has been a thing in FEH for as long as there's been an overly dominant unit, even back in the early days of FEH with stuff like Reinhardt. One of the easiest things people did at the time was run Triangle Adept Green Mages to deal with him, then coupled with a Grand Raven and Bowbreaker to check the soon-to-be-released Brave Lyn. But IS gave you an out if you didn't feel like building a unit for that purpose with the release of Sigurd, a low-resistance sword cavalry unit, and Brave Ike, an axe infantry that were built as direct responses to Reinhardt, a blue mage cav. At least in Ike's case, being green was always going to net some advantage, but how was Sigurd of all characters built to deal with a Reinhardt? Introducing Divine Tearfang and Crusader's Ward, the former being a weapon that halved all magic damage on the first attack, and the latter reducing all magic damage by 80% after the first attack, so no matter what, Sigurd was reducing Reinhardt's damage by amounts that would let any unit survive against him. The latter being worded to directly mess with one of the only units that could meet the condition didn't make it any less subtle either. Meanwhile, Brave Ike just had Crusader's Ward built into his weapon Irvan, but it worked against every type of foe comparatively, and he came with an exclusive skill in Bjork's Blessing, which neutralized all bonuses against cavalry and flyers during combat. This was the other countermeasure that Ike came with, since Reinhardt and cavalry in general back then were ran with Hone Cav and Fortified Cavalry skills that boosted an ally stats at the start of the turn and would effectively put a hard cap on his damage ceiling. Granted, a lot of people didn't use it over other options due to the specifics of the skill, but Irvan could naturally allow Ike to survive anyway. Damage reduction in general would also be the downfall of Reinhardt over time, especially when it became a lot more accessible, but it was definitely a much more targeted response with the release of Sigurd and Brave Ike. And speaking of very targeted responses, you have a lot more examples. I've already beaten the topic of Valentine's Leon to death in many videos over the course of this year, so I'll keep it brief. Back in December of 2023, we had the release of Legendary Camilla, and she was a hybrid nuke in support, but the most standout thing she did was pre-combat damage, which effectively reduced the foe's HP by a large amount before the combat began, making her one of the best nukes at her peak. We had skills a bit earlier at that point that did the same thing, but they were capped at 7 each and could be ran together for a total of 14. Camilla could easily easily do upwards of 30 plus depending on the foe. Fast forward a couple months and we have the release of Devoted Basket Plus and Valentine's Leon, both of which did the exact same thing, except the former was inheritable to every single red mage, and the latter could shut off turns. Naturally, the latter was much more of an amicable threat and would inevitably get hard countered, but the pre-combat damage effect in general had been widely considered to be over the top, especially when any red tome could deal that much damage. So much so that they released Breath of Life 4, which not only neutralized the effect entirely, but healed above the amount so you could always have any ally healthy. And because of how overtuned it was and continues to be, it's seen everywhere that isn't in PvE. Many would consider this the big nerf that countered Leon, and while it did a fair bit of damage, it wouldn't really be until the release of Firm Canto Curb that outright disabled his end turn effects, which at that point it was over for him. We did also have the release of Nullsea Disrupt Echo that didn't really impact him as much as it could have, despite being a fairly solid Echo skill in general. Actually, when I think about it, we've had a lot of skills that were released with the intent of countering a specific unit, but ended up not really amounting to anything in the end. Back in Book 3, IS released Spring Pala, who was a direct response to the once dominant Surtur, a highly bulky axe armor that prevented follow-up attacks. Spring Pala was released as a red dagger flyer with an inheritable weapon that had built-in armor effectiveness, and if the unit had a weapon triangle advantage, then it neutralized any follow-up prevention effects. Granted, the amount of red daggers we had by that point was limited, Pala being one of the only 3 at the time, but they'd soon release Idun, who was also red and had built-in armor effectiveness, all for the purpose of beating Surtur, who took off more than the weapon itself. There was also the release of Ruse 4, which was supposed to be the final nail in the coffin for units like Bride Catria and Winter Cordelia, who enabled player phase brave attacks to allies. The former was much more prevalent due to the spacing flexibility that Catria offered over Cordelia, since the latter required adjacency, but still fulfilled a decent enough niche. However, Ruse 4, which disabled both of them, came out by the time they were already gone, partly because units were able to hit hard enough without their assistance by that point, especially when paired with the once notable legendary male Robin, who gave out a significant amount of stats to allies that couldn't be removed via Grand Strategy. Grand Strategy effectively reversed any debuffs a unit might have had and turned them into bonuses during combat, but because they were penalties, they couldn't be negated outside of removing Grand Strategy itself, which was limited to Summer Thor and Summoner duels only, until the release of Ploy 4 skills that eventually neutered his support. And on the topic of Catria and Cordelia again, there's always been an up and down usage rate when it came to both of them in modes such as Aetherites due to future unit releases in Elamine and Freyr. The entire timeline in general also plays into other hard counters that would follow in the game. Units like Bride Catria, as well as other units that gave out notable start of turn effects, would end up getting disabled with the release of Elamine, who negated all start of turn effects with false start penalties. Fast forward a year and a half later, you have the release of Freyr, who negates every start of turn penalty, rendering units like Elamine worthless, followed by the release of Ruse 4 several months after that could get around Freyr's cleanse effect because the penalty was applied during the turn. There were other types of units that would follow a chain of counters until they ended up irrelevant. Take Legendary Sigurd for example, the first 4 movement cavalry unit who gave out extra movement to allies when his special went off. One of the first immediate responses to him was with the release of Safety Fence that prevented him and the rest of his allies from moving on turn 1, which alleviated some issues with his threat range. Fast forward a few months and you have the release of Pirate Nacella and Stall Ploy that was built specifically to shut off Legendary Sigurd, as it replaced any movement buff with gravity in cardinal directions. However, that was locked to a limited time seasonal unit, so many people didn't end up pulling for it, which is when IS decided to release Reeve in early 2022 as what would potentially be the final nail in the coffin for Sigurd. Reeve debuted with a PRF and Argent Aura that inflicted stall on the slowest foes and foes within 2 spaces of the recipient, which usually ended up being Sigurd himself due to the stat line leaning heavily into his attack and defense, or if not him directly, he would get hit passively by the splash range or shut off the rest of the team if put out of range of Sigurd due to the movement buff he gave out after the special proc. Loki's Refind also released a month prior to Reeve himself, who had built-in stall ploy, which was one of the few times where a Refind could be used to deal with specific threats. Makoto also got similar treatment when she debuted cancel control into the game via Doting Staff, which limited units such as Reagan, Atri, and the more infamously known Yuri from running in, attacking or breaking a structure, and then running 2 to 3 spaces away with cancel mechanics. It would be short-lived when Medius would release in the following month with an inheritable version of cancel control, but it was still a refined built around the idea of dealing with the then relevant high-tier threats. Medius was also able to negate one of the strongest Aether Raid structures in Bolt Tower, which inflicted dozens of damage on the enemy team at the start of turn 3 with his own status in guard. It was so good at the time that people ran him off season just for the effect. Other similar types of refines could include Mipha, who got a refine that boosted her visible defense, allowing her to meet isolation checks much more easily. Mipha's claim to fame at the time was her ability to stop dancers on Aether Raid's defense with her high defense stat, but with the release of units such as Masquerade Eldigan, you could effectively avoid it because her stats weren't high enough. You could do it with other dancers such as Xander and Berkut, but Eldigan was free to play and easily mergeable while also having his best tools readily available in the free-to-play Grail shop, so most people went to him specifically. So when it came time to update Mipha, they made sure she was capable of getting around every high defense refresher to ensure she could use her isolation effect consistently. IS has had other similar responses to notable meta threats by releasing units that directly negated everything the meta unit was capable of. As mentioned earlier in the video, Reinhardt had very direct responses in Sigurd and Brave Ike, but other units such as Ophelia, Legendary Alm, Fallen Edelgard, and even more recently with Windclad and Nurgle, followed similar fates. Ophelia was the undisputed top AoE nuke at her peak because she could instantly charge her own specials, which was extremely difficult to do at that point in time. And with the Hardy Bearing Seal, she could reliably use an AoE attack on an opponent and then hit once to finish them off. The direct response to that was to release a unit called Nagi, who reduced all AoE damage by 80%, was green, and an armor for the extra stats, and she completely face tanked her. Legendary Alm in a similar fashion was one of the best initiators in the game at his peak because of how high his damage scaling was at the time. He got extra damage based on how much defense the foe had, so continually stacking it also made him inadvertently stronger as a result, on top of having a 2 cooldown special that added extra damage based on his speed and reduced the foe's defense even more when it went off. And in response to this, IS decided to release Fallen Leon, and he was very much intended to be the Alm counter, even going as far as showing him in his own trailer. He had a triangle advantage against colorless units, which Alm was, and he reduced all range damage by 50% as well as AoE damage by 80%, which also caught Ophelia in the crossfire once again. Of course, if we're also talking about more infamous examples, then you could look no further than Fallen Edelgard. I think many would consider Fallen Edelgard to be the highest point of power creep due to everything she did as a unit at the time. She was a bulky mixed phase beast armor that had damage reduction, special fighter, post-combat healing, Gale Force, and Distant Counter, on top of being one of the best scoring units at the time, so you were going to run into her no matter what. Edelgard could also initiate combat fairly well due to her kit granting extra movement. She could spam bonfires or go for 3 attacks in the player phase because of her PRF special fighter, heal back a lot of health in tandem with the Mystic Boost Seal, and not only prevent foes from charging their specials because of the same mechanic that helped her spam specials, but she also had follow-up prevention, meaning that you were not going to reliably double her without any sort of no follow-up. Combined with the distant counter in her weapon, you couldn't even safely initiate onto her either. Suffice to say, a lot of people struggled dealing with her because of all of these factors, and over the course of several months, IS would release many additions to deal with her, whether that was a plethora of units with no follow-up, breath sacred seals to get around her special prevention, or outright release units that one-shot her. The most blatant of the counters would be none other than legendary male Byleth, who had an insta-charge special that scaled damage more against dragons and beasts, pierced damage reduction, and gave out no follow-up to himself and nearby allies during combat. Funnily enough, another Byleth would end up countering a dominant 3 houses leader in the form of Windclad, who was not only able to spam incredibly hard-hitting specials, but had obscenely good player phase and enemy phase bulk thanks to his beast slot Deep Star. He had a lot of special jump capabilities which allowed him to spam lethality against most types of foes, and after initiating combat, he reduced all damage by 80% for his first combat, making it difficult to initiate onto him at times despite being a green dagger flyer. However, only 3 months later, with Winter Byleth release, who was a red armor that stopped Windclawed from charging his specials and could pierce through his damage reduction, effectively rendering him moot after that point. And speaking of red armors that were released to stop stupidly strong units, let's talk about Neathhogger and Nurgle for a second. Nurgle debuted back in May of this year and was arguably at his peak one of, if not the strongest units in the entire game because of a status he introduced in Essence Drain. Essence Drain effectively stole all bonuses off the target and nearby allies and spread them to everybody who had Essence Drain as a status for that turn. That, on top of Nurgle being an incredibly tanky unit who could also spam specials akin to Windclawed, was someone who could carry on his own. Before the release of Nurgle, IS was already attempting to limit bonus manipulation in some capacity with the likes of Tina and Mythic Loki, both released in January and April of this year respectively. However, both of them were much easier to work around, whereas having it as a status significantly increased the chances of bonus negation, and as such he was seen everywhere. Fast forward to last month with the release of Neathhogger, and she introduces a new status in Dosage, which was specifically designed to stop Nurgle. Dosage prevents the foe from negating or stealing a unit's bonuses if they were able to both neutralize and spread it to allies, and in the wording specifically singled out Nurgle. And this is also really important because you need to have both conditions met. So you can still have somebody like Loki and Summer Thor negate all bonuses just because they don't steal the bonuses and spread them around. It definitely hurt him in some capacity, as she is also conveniently one of the best armors in the game at this current time, so many people are going to run her just for that aspect alone. We did recently get the announcement of Emblem Lyn, which can allow for Nurgle and other allies to snipe statuses from 5 spaces away, so maybe he'll have a bit more longevity, but regardless, Dosage did a fair bit to him. And on the topic of Emblem Lyn, I think it's worth mentioning anti-warp effects and skills. Anti-warping as an effect really started taking off back in 2023 with the release of Guidance 4 and Soaring Guidance that allowed units to move around the map much more easily, so units such as Gatekeeper inevitably rose to the top of support relevancy as a result. Later on, we would get the release of Ratatasker and Valentine's Myrrh, the former applying anti-warping as a terrain and the latter giving it out as a status. It was at a point where you could have a really strong defensive core that negated any possibility of warping from the foe until the release of Emblem Celica, Legendary Male Shez, and Emblem Lyn. Emblem Celica had innate pass built into her special, so she could naturally teleport and snipe any unit she wanted, including the unit that prevented warping entirely. Shez also followed in her footsteps, but instead of high space warping, he could teleport to any ally that's entered combat from as far away as possible. And while those two units brought about their own troubles, I would say that it would be with the release of Emblem Lyn and her emblem effect that really hard countered anti-warping mechanics, as she and any ranged unit that has her ring effect equipped can snipe a unit from 5 to 6 spaces away. This also affected the recently released Barricade that was simply anti-warping the C slot. Although for what it's worth, it still has plenty of opportunities to prove itself useful because warping is still going to be a common effect. Unlike Brave Claude, who lost every opportunity to function following the release of Valentine's Lift. Brave Claude, despite being a bow flyer, was a competent enough tank at the time because of the amount of healing he got from his weapon. As long as he was able to land a special, he healed back half of his HP, which worked tremendously with the likes of Quick Riposte, allowing him to reliably double as well. He was one of the few units in his archetype that could reliably function as a ranged flyer, since the class itself was very much one of the worst in the entire game due to the lack of available skills they had access to. That said, it didn't take very long until he would get nerfed by the likes of Valentine's Lift, but the unit themselves was more of a direct response to Brave Ike, who at the time reduced a lot of damage and healed back with Aether spamming. Valentine's Lift was the first introduction of having damage reduction in the game, as well as introducing Fatal Smoke 3, which prevented all in-combat and post-combat healing effects and skills. So in an attempt to counter Brave Ike, it simultaneously messed up Brave Claude as a result. What also didn't help was the release of Legendary Sigurd a couple months later, who also came with Fatal Smoke 3, and while the skill itself was only ever found on those two units for the the most part, they were very much found on a majority of Aetherite's defense teams, and as a result, it was unavoidable. Moreover, by the time both of them seized any meta relevancy, Brave Claude was incapable of tanking due to units not only hitting harder, but Claude himself lacking a modicum amount of tanking effects, stats, and damage output as a result of his archetype, with the added sting of his refine not really being enough for him to make any sort of comeback. And while I didn't have any specific unit that would have really sealed the deal for this video, I did want to bring up Brave Hector as an honorable mention. Brave Hector, post-refine and post-hardy fighter, was unequivocally the best tank in the entire game because he nullified any class weaknesses he had, was incredibly bulky, prevented doubles thanks to his follow-up denial effect with hardy fighter in tandem with the built-in null follow-up effect, and could hit hard enough to deal with squishy nukes. And as a result of his dominance, IS would release a handful of units in an attempt to deal with him. And I specify the word attempt as many would fall flat, including one of the most on-the-nose counters in Pirate Hinoka. Pirate Hinoka was a green bow flyer that had built-in armor effectiveness, adaptive damage, allowing her to target Hector's lower defensive stats, and got player phase Brave if she was not only faster than the foe, but had a triangle advantage over them, which was hyper-specific towards Brave Hector. And yet, despite all of that, she still failed to deal with Brave Hector consistently, especially when used with the Fluct Missile, which reduced damage against bows and daggers by 80% if they hit consecutively, similar to that of Crusader's Ward, and he just kept going on about his day until he was incapable of tanking anymore. There was something similar to that in Fagato and Ice Fiorm, who was also directly made to counter her, since he could disable Fiorm's bread and butter special that allowed her to tank and kill most initiators in the game. However, he was inconsistent due to both of them sharing similar speed stats, and granted, he didn't lose to Fiorm, but he never outright beat her in many such cases. Still funny to see that all this time later, it's the hyper-specific green bow attempting to deal with the lance armor and failing. And other than that, that's really about it. There's most likely a lot of other stuff that I missed, but I feel that these were the most standoutish of the bunch, so if there's anything you think was worth mentioning, then let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, then make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.